Good day. My name is Kim Moody, and I'm your host for In the Mood with G C Moody podcast. And today, I want to talk to you under the common theme of "Won't Get Fooled Again," which is the title of a famous song by the classic rock band The Who. And so I'll come back to that theme on the two things that I want to talk to you about today. One is just an update in terms of the capital gains proposals, because the last time I did this podcast, the capital gains proposals were on life support. I had called them dead, but there was nothing official yet. And literally a few days after I recorded my last podcast, sure enough, there was some announcements by the federal government. So I'll talk about that. And then I'll talk about, the second thing, which is how tax policy is done. The capital gains proposals are a bad example of how tax policy should be done, and the politics surrounding this, because of recent Canadian events, really amplifies that as well. So those are the two things I want to talk about: the capital gains proposals, and then tax policy and politics, and how on introducing measures like this, and how Canada needs to do better. So let me just digress, because it's under the common theme of "Won't Get Fooled Again." For those of you who know me personally, you'll know that I'm a big classic rock fan. And I am because of its simplicity and silliness of lyrics. You don't have to think too hard with classic rock. Usually it's three chords and, like I said, some silly lyrics. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll tends to dominate. But for those who know me, and I've written about this a fair amount, one of my first career choices, besides being an NHL superstar, was to be a music teacher, because I love the study of the theory of music. I studied at a pretty high level. And I also was a pretty good piano player. I got up to grade 10, Royal Conservatory and Western Board. And I was a decent trumpet player as well. Played in some bands, and I really loved it. But as I entered my grade 12 high school years, I realized that, I'm good, but I'm not that good. In order to excel and make a good living, even as a music teacher, you got to be, in the elite, in my view. And so I pivoted and chose accounting and tax, and the rest is history. So I've always had this admiration for music, and in a particular classical music. And whenever I study or work, I'm not one of those people that can work in silence. I need some distraction in the background. But I can't listen to classical music, which is my favorite form of music. I love Beethoven and Bach and Mozart and Tchaikovsky, all the classics. I love them. But I can't have it listening. I can't listen to it in the background because it's very distracting, because I'm always thinking about the mathematics behind the music. I'm thinking about the tone changes, the rhythm changes, etc. I can't do it. It's too distracting. And so what I need in the background, and what I've grown to really like in the background, is simple music like classic rock. And so over the years, I've really enjoyed The Who. I've enjoyed the Rolling Stones, some of the 80s, bands, which were pretty entertaining more than anything. And so I'm a classic rock guy. And, The Who, with their song, "Won't Get Fooled Again," has a famous line, which I'll talk about later, as I get to the politics section. But I do think it's apropos with respect to capital gains and tax policy. So let's talk about capital gains. So last time I did this podcast, as I said, on life support, a few days later, the government of Canada came out saying that the capital gains proposals would be deferred until January 1st of 2026. For those of you that need a reminder, the proposals were first introduced in the 24 federal budget on April 16th, 24, and they were to take effect on June the 25th of 24, an increase from 50% to 2/3 for all taxpayers, with the exception of individuals and certain trusts who would get a $250,000 threshold annually at the lower rate of 50%. You know, the, besides being just poor tax policy, because it puts a hole in tax integration, which I won't get into today, the whole introduction of these proposals were cluttered with political rhetoric. And just to stop there for a second, I don't think most tax practitioners would mind at least a debate and the introduction of an inclusion rate increase, as long as it was grounded in decent policy. Is there a reason why you're increasing the inclusion rate? Oh, well, let's have a debate about that. The reality is the government really, in my view, just simply needed money, and they needed to reduce the deficit that they were in trouble on. And so this was a easy way to do that, in quotes. And so, of course, it was clouded with messages like only 0.13% of people would be affected, which was total bullshit. And they said that it was necessary for the rich to pay a little bit more, and that these measures were necessary to provide for intergenerational fairness, and that there's a so-called capital gains advantage, in quotes, for investment bankers. I mean, it just went on and on. The silliness of the messaging was really, really ridiculous. And that's the part that certainly me got fairly angry about, along with the fact that it pierced a hole in tax integration. So those are the two things that really upset me. The third thing that upset me about these proposals is the proposed implementation date of June the 25th of 24. So what the government was doing was encouraging Canadians to to accelerate gains that they otherwise would not have done. And so, again, pretty upset about that, because that reverses the usual equation. Tax should not drive the investment dog. The tax tail should not drive the investment dog. It's usually the other way around. If it's a good investment decision to dispose of, then great, do it. Fast forward to to December, and we did not see a bill put forward for these proposals. We saw some draft legislation, and we saw a notice of Ways and Means motion that was introduced in June and in September of 24. But that was it. There was no bill before the House of Commons. And so when Parliament recessed in December, people like me said, well, what's going on here? I mean, for 2024, are taxpayers going to have to pay, or are these things dead? And I called it, I said it was dead, but nothing formal. So fast forward to January 6th, we have the prorogation of Parliament and the so-called resignation of our Prime Minister. And then we have the Liberal leadership campaign commenced on that day as well, to replace Justin Trudeau. And when there's a prorogation of Parliament, all bills before the House die. And so, the capital gains proposals, if they weren't dead in December, they were looking really dead on January the 6th, but nothing official yet. Fast forward to January 31st, so a few days after I did my last podcast, and sure enough, the proposals were officially, in their words, deferred to January 1st, 2026. Well, again, pretty dead at that point. Now, the one thing the government did right, to give credit, is there was a proposal in the April 16, 2024 budget that the capital gains deduction, which was proposed to be increased from an indexation amount of $1,016,000 for 24 to $1.25 million from June the 25th of 24 forward. So on the January 31st, 2025 announcement, they said, yes, we intend to retain that increase, which I think is fair and the right thing to do, because otherwise you'd have all these dispositions that occurred after June the 24th of last year, where they're claiming capital gains deduction and assuming that it'd be at the higher amount of 1.25, but it could have been actually down to 1,016,000. So yeah, there would have been unexpected tax bills being paid. So I think that's the right thing to do. So fast forward, actually just take a step back to January 16th, a couple weeks prior to the announcement that the capital gains proposals are being deferred. And the opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative Party, announced again, just to reaffirm that if the Conservatives are getting elected or would get elected, that the capital gains proposals would not pass muster. In other words, they wouldn't support them. So very much looks like on January 31st that you can defer all you want, but these things are dead. Fast forward to the Liberal leadership campaign, and we have front runner Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister who resigned in a fury, just before the fall economic statement of December the 16th of 24. And she was the one that, that was rather passionate about introducing these proposals. It was necessary for the rich and, intergenerational fairness and et cetera, et cetera. Both of them, both Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland, distanced themselves from the capital gains proposals. So again, look like they're dead. And fast forward to just a few days ago, on March the 9th, and we have, I think it was a charade of a Liberal leadership campaign, because it's pretty obvious the Liberal Party wanted to crown Mark Carney as their savior, and sure enough, in a landslide, was elected. One can debate, what I said, but I do think it was most reasonable people, I think, would suggest that Liberal leadership campaign was a bit of a charade. And Mark Carney once again affirmed that the capital gains proposals would not be put forward should he get elected. So where are we today? Well, and let's take another step back here in terms of what have we seen from the introduction of tax policy in the last number of years? Well, we've seen introduction of the underused housing tax, and there was a whole debacle on that in terms of filing. A lot of Canadians had to file under the threat of $5,000 penalties for not, even though they're not subject to the tax. There's been some subsequent legislation released to make that better, but the introduction of it caused a whole fury in the tax community. Then we had the new trust reporting rules and the introduction of the Bear Trust required reporting, with the CRA announcing essentially on the last day of filing that, Bear Trust wouldn't need to file. And that happened last year, about a year ago now, roughly, in 24. So that caused a big fury because lots of work put in by the tax community to only say, just kidding. And now the capital gains stuff, just kidding. So, this is not the way to introduce taxation policy. Significant changes to taxation policy need to be more engaging. And what I mean by that is, before you just simply introduce political tax measures, there should be an engagement with the tax community, affected stakeholders, just a long list of people, because it affects people. And when you say, just kidding, there's a lot of effort put in. And this country has a real productivity problem. And measures like that, where all of a sudden you're just kidding, it doesn't help. Besides that, and I've been fielding phone calls like crazy since the end of January, when the government announced, a so-called deferral of these capital gains measures. We have numerous clients in our firm that decided to, after receiving advice and, the pros and cons and, hey, is this thing ever going to get through? They decided to monetize and trigger gains. And for the ones that decided to trigger with cash and without any protection of, Section 85 elections, for example, what do those people do? There's really nothing you can do. If you've triggered the gain, monetized for cash, prior to June the 25th to 24 to try and protect against a higher inclusion rate down the road. And then now all of a sudden, looking back, that wasn't necessary. I find that just horrible. And yes, a lot of these clients were well advised on the risks, but most taxation policy that's introduced will ultimately get introduced. And so that, just kidding risk was kind of low in the whole scheme of things. But, politics and always gets in the way. And this is a weird time in Canadian tax history and Canadian history in general. And so I find, I find that kind of introduction of tax policy very, very offensive. And to get back to my point, I think Canada needs a much better way of introducing tax policy, which is my second point that I want to talk to you about today. And the way to do this, and I've been on my pulpit for probably the last 15 years, is we need tax reform. And I'm a bit of a purist. I think tax reform would, the country would benefit from a very, very thorough review of how it should tax and how it could tax, and then, just start, maybe not from zero, but re-look at the architecture that we have today and see whether or not we should bring it down to its studs and rebuild. Because I think the studs are still pretty good, but a lot of what's been built around those studs is rotting and it's bloated. And so I have been criticized quite a lot for being a purist on tax policy because it'll take a long time, it'll take a lot of effort. And ultimately the criticism comes from the fact that, our political system and environment likely doesn't provide for such a purist approach. And I can't disagree with that. I mean, I think that criticism is fair. But I'll take tax reform in pretty much any form it comes in. And so what I do like is what Pierre Poilievre of the Conservative Party has, and this is the political part of the of the podcast. So if you don't want to listen to politics, you can turn it off right now. But what the Conservative Party has proposed, that should they get elected, that within 60 days of Pierre Poilievre becoming Prime Minister, that he would convene a tax reform task force. I always have trouble saying that fast. And ultimately, it would look at, I'll just look at my notes here, there would be three things that would be on the agenda for this task force. One, lower taxes on work, hiring, and making stuff. Number two, reduce the share of taxes paid by the poor and middle income earners. And three, reduce paperwork by 20% by simplifying tax. Well, those are pretty broad principles. They're good principles. And frankly, the terms of the committee hasn't been obviously determined because the Conservatives would need to get elected first. But if a committee was convened like that, I'm confident that something positive would come out of it. And a lot of these concerns that we've had with, the so-called just kidding approach that I've talked about would hopefully be dealt with and recommendations put forward to try to prevent that in the future. So I'm ultimately, very, very hopeful that we see something like this. And where does this get down to? Well, let's talk a little bit more politics and then I'll close it off here. But, today, as I record this on March the 12th, Canada is in a lot of turmoil. We have Mark Carney, who's about to be appointed, the new Prime Minister because he got elected as the new Liberal leader. Speculation is that we're going to have an election called soon after that. And we've got Donald Trump, the U.S. president, who is imposing tariffs on Canada. One day the tariffs are on, one day they're off, the next day they're on, or on certain products. This morning apparently we have new 25% tariffs on steel, being, so it's just constant tension and stress. And ultimately it's exposing Canada's vulnerability on a whole number of fronts. And so, we do need effective leadership at the wheel. Do I think it's Mark Carney? Well, my personal observation is absolutely not. I think this person is a tax and spend person, and frankly, I think he's dangerous on a number of fronts. On the tax side, which is more my area of expertise, I don't think Mark Carney is all that interested in tax reform. And so instead, he's more interested in spending. And I could talk to you about his proposal to separate the government budget into a so-called operational budget and a capital budget. And I wrote about that in my Financial Post piece. That's just an accounting trick, an accounting game to try and hide spending. So it's pretty clear to me that a Mark Carney-led Liberal government would be, continue to be very, very interventionist, including on silly tax policy. And so we need, as a country, to get our spending under control and to have much more positive taxation policy that is engaging with affected stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier in this podcast, and ultimately reward the people that take risks, because we need risk takers to provide jobs and have made in Canada solutions. And so tax reform, in my view, is a foundational way forward, and we need that. And so where does, won't get fooled again? Well, come into this. Well, I really don't want Canadians to get fooled again on the introduction of tax policy where it's just kidding. It's cost Canadians and their advisors a lot of effort and wasted productivity. Number two, I really want to see tax reform come to Canada. And, the new leader of the Liberal Party, in my view, is the same, has the same values and concepts as the old leader, Justin Trudeau. And you can see that with who Mark Carney is surrounding himself with. His new chief of staff is, and the former justice minister, and the policies that they're talking about on carbon tax, and it just goes on and on. So I'm hopeful that Canadians won't get fooled again just because we have a shiny new leader at the Liberal helm. We need positive change. We need tax reform. So that's it for today. Thank you for indulging me, and no shortage of activity going on. So feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm happy to debate, happy to talk. All the best to you. Go Canada. Bye now.